Hello everybody, and welcome for being here for this conference. I'm Oscar Argallo. This is my first time in this conference as well. I'm the technical manager of Bioconservacion. So if I know some of you, not all of you, I hope I will get to know all of you by the end of the conference. And you will have the chance to learn a little bit more about the technical department. On Wednesday, we'll visit the laboratory, we will visit our factory. So I'm not going to explain what we do in the technical department, what our functions are. You will see this, and you can always talk to me in the middle of the presentation. Again, I wanted to excuse Nicolo, who had a personal problem. His wife has been taken to the hospital. It's nothing serious, but we're going to be waiting for good news about this. So without further ado, I'm going to leave you with Alex von Stempel, Director of Cool Logistic Resources, who's going to give a speech on the situation of the market, and is going to conduct the presentation as well, I'm sure, very well. Again, thank you for being here. Welcome.
How will I get out of this here?
Welcome. Sorry. Here we go. Fruit handling and logistics trends. That's my topic today. What I'm trying to do is to set this meeting into a broader context of what's happening in the fruit handling and logistics sector, covering in broad brush everything from production to retail, with a particular focus on maritime. So, just to myself, basically I'm running Cool Logistics series of events which cover exactly what I just described, everything from production to retail, with a focus on logistics, with a strong focus on maritime logistics, but also air freight, land transport, including road and rail, conferences which we're running it in different places. Our next one's going to be in Antwerp in October. We did one in Algeciras last year, and we've done events in Africa, in Asia, and in the Americas. Went to Sao Paulo, various other places. So without further ado, I'm going to continue and talk about what all this is all about. Okay, the agenda, we're going to look at retail trends, Persian logistics trends, ocean freight, technology, and the very fact that we have diverging trends, hence the llama. Right, so I'm trying to, so it's like a conundrum that we're faced with to some extent. On one hand, we've got the consumer who wants increasing amount of convenience, who wants things simple, who wants thinks of the digital natives, who want to have things personalized at a tip of a finger on a computer, and they can buy and sell and trade as much as they want. But of course, the stuff needs to be physically handled. Like an old friend of mine, a professor at the University of Northwestern Illinois, said to me, logistics and transport go hand in hand. One with the other is just like clapping with one hand. So that's really what we're talking about. So I'm going to look about ship sizes and the fact that the evolution of bigger ships leads to potential disruption. And the biggest challenge I think we have is the explosion of packaging, which leads to the fact that we're having more and more packaging. That is basically what the consumer, to some extent, desires. It's a reflection of what the consumer desires, not what he wants. But to personalize a product, you need to package it accordingly, which is why we have an explosion in the packaging sector, and also the whole problem of waste that is covered up, linked to that. It's intrinsically linked to that. So let's look at the quick types of reefer cargoes that we have in the market. There's everything from fruit and vegetables, which is the leading commodity, seafood and meats, basically protein, flowers, pharmaceuticals. Now I'm going to jump around. Ready meals, that's an increasing market. Wine, small amounts, but high value commodities, for example, are shipped by sea. Consumer electronics, chocolate, all these products, of course, are being shipped in reefer containers. So that's why I call them reefer cargoes. Just to give you an idea of basically what we've seen in EU fruit imports, the movement between 2016 and 2010 is that even though, perhaps it doesn't show it terribly well in the graph, that there hasn't been actually much change in the origins of fresh produce in the last 6 years. The main thing is actually that the value has increased, basically from 12.9 billion euros to 19.6 billion euros in a relatively short period of time. So it's not the volume, but it's the value of the products that have increased. I'll leave that with you to ponder for a moment. And what we've seen quite clearly in the markets, that to some extent explains what I've just said. The blue area is Northern Europe and America, and that is steadily growing. That is still the biggest market in terms of volume and also value, because in Europe we still have got the purchasing power. At the same time, we've got obviously China growing as a giant growth engine. Everyone's looking at China. You must have seen it if you went to Food Logistica in Berlin last week, where I was as well. Everyone is focusing on China. Possibly Europeans not quite as much as they should. And I think it's the situation where we've seen the Latin Americans are stealing, clearly have been stealing a march on the European producers and exporters. Other countries that have been developing, of course, are Hong Kong, India too, but from a relatively low base, again because of the purchasing power. The one country where we see an increasing purchasing power developing is China, which is why it is the most important market. So remember what I said earlier on about the value. It's like the value migration, although the volume stays the same. But instantly, we could possibly have a situation where we have more and more actually moving towards Asia, possibly at the expense of Europe. I thought I brought this slide up as well, because the food waste by region tells us quite an interesting story. I haven't got a laser pointer here, but the key thing here is that in Europe and in Americas, most of the waste is created by the consumer, so at the end of the supply chain. Whereas in countries like Africa, Central Asia, and also Latin America, most of the waste actually is created at the beginning of the supply chain. This is exactly where I think this audience is really targeting onto, in the whole area of post-harvest. The problems which I've raised here with this image of the packaging is more looking at the problems in the logistics chain that are happening. So however good a product is at start, all it can do is deteriorate. And so if you also got a logistic problem on top of the product itself, product failure, due to temperature, etc., these factors together lead to increasing waste. So it's just really to show the food waste by country. Now let's see whether this works. I'll put a little film in here. What do I do here? No, it doesn't work. Let's skip the film, it's too long. Any old bit. I brought this picture up here is to show the deployment of container vessels by trade. The biggest share of ships, the increasing share in shipping is largely due to the container. So we're just going to focus on the container shipping side here. And what is interesting is that we see the deployment of big vessels, particularly on areas such as the Europe Far East, which is the biggest column there, because you can see that, one on the left, I'll point at it, you see the fourth. But all the other areas describe, and the dark column on the right is the one that shows the increase. We've seen a progressive shift of bigger vessels into every single trade. This is called cascading in the world of maritime logistics. And the reason why I put that picture on the right, where the vessel of Zheng He, who was a legendary Chinese seafarer in the beginning of the Ming Dynasty, is to show the comparison with that of the little ship underneath, which is the ship of Christopher Columbus, who I think you call Colon. The thing is, these big vessels, we've been there before, bigger vessels and smaller vessels, just for you to think what this could mean. There's room for everyone, but some may disappear. Exactly, that's what we've seen in the container market share, with the biggest vessels up to 22,000 TEU vessels even. And the market shares here, Maersk is number one, followed by MSC, then we have CMA, and the big question here is COSCO. COSCO is this one, it's the lilac one, if you can see. Left, the green one, that is COSCO, which has recently bought OOCL, and it could well become soon the biggest container line. But in the areas of reefers, they're still a very small player. After that, we've got Hapag-Lloyd, who bought several other companies. One is the new name of the Japanese line, which has just been created, of basically a merger between Mitsuyo's K-Line, Nippon Yusen K-Line, and K-Line, the three Japanese carriers forming one Japanese line. Evergreen, and then a few others. So what we see here, key thing is concentration. There are three big players. Four, let's say four, just five. No more than 5 big players in the container shipping market. So to give you some figures as well, how it's actually work out. Food transport by sea is that actually the fresh food share, even though fresh produce is very important, the fresh food share, which is transported by sea, only represents 3% of container traffic. So part of the container world, food, fresh produce is very small. Very important, but very small. And the main business is basically between South and North, Latin America, Europe, Latin America, North America, and Latin America increasingly into Asia. And the key thing here is, as I mentioned earlier on, we've seen a clear shift from containers, from conventional shipping to containers, with a share of projected share by Seabury from 85 to 50%. At the moment, still sort of just hovering around 18-19% of conventional ships. So that's not containers, but these are reefer bulk vessels. Fresh food represents 53% of temperature-controlled logistics market. And I put that figure in there because it covers all modes. It's not just shipping. Just to see how important fresh food is, and of which, of course, fruit is one element. Bananas, just to give you an idea, represent 25%, apples 10%, and onions 7% each, so very important commodities. And if you look at the reefer container side, you have to split it up. You've got the frozen side and the fresh side. The frozen side is primarily the protein, so it's obviously meats, Argentinian meat, for example, or frozen fish, salmon from Chile, few other big commodities. Pork and beef, particularly now being shipped to China, with increasing demand for these kind of commodities, all largely moving in frozen containers. So within the whole reefer container side, there's a very important frozen side, but the fresh one is the interesting one because that's where things can go wrong. Right? Yes, and the annual food volume increase by sea, according to Seabury, is that what they said at our own conference in Algeciras a few months ago, was 4%. Having spoken to them since, the forecast is actually going down to 3%. So it's interesting, why should there's a slightly a slowing of reefer container volumes foreseen for the next few years. It's fairly steady, but it's still growing. And just to put this out into big figures again, so 120 million tons of reefer cargoes worldwide. And these are now distributed amongst the main commodities. First of all, I'll show you shipping lines, now I'll show you the commodities. Interesting thing is there that the area of meat and dairy is increasing slightly faster. So the frozen element is in itself probably growing faster than the fresh side. But as remember, the value is the one that increases, not necessarily the volume. So it's volume and value. Why? So I just bought in this, I just read this in The Guardian, a local newspaper in England, where it just looked at countries like the UK, where the lower middle and upper middle class income are determining the demand for processed food. Processed food is growing has always been very, very high in the UK. Look at other countries like Spain, it's only 20.3, Portugal is 10.2, because you eat a much greater proportion of fresh produce now down here, if you're looking at from the UK. Interesting is also Malta, which is also fairly high. If you see Malta compared with Greece and Cyprus, it's a British colony. So this is also, you can see this almost in the food habits, how this is represented, the different types. And what is also the, because that's really, it's under 20, the blue areas and the over 50%, which are eating processed food. So this again is a challenge for the fresh produce market per se. And the key feature here of processed food, the advantage is it's got long shelf life. From point of view of logistics, shelf life is what is easier to control when it's processed. It's far more, you can plan, there are no vagaries, there's no problems of weather, droughts, which of course are always impacting the world of fresh produce in particular. If I put this in context with the demand for reefer boxes, when I mentioned earlier on the increase is about 3% only, the reason why is for the first time last year, 2016, we had a greater demand for reefer boxes than supply. So we have, in other words, a looming capacity shortage in reefer containers. In itself a reflection of the concentration of power amongst the big shipping companies, because they're the ones who own the shipping containers themselves or through leasing companies. Now I'm just mentioning these other factors. So Drury is talking about a 3% increase. Seabury was talking about a 4% increase. So we're going towards a slight slowing down in the reefer growth, which is linked to the capacity shortage. And then there are other factors which we need to bring in. It's like oil price. We see an increased oil price, which of course affects shipping, because the major cost for shipping is of course bunker fuel. So if that increases too much, that could mean that the shipping companies would want to increase even further what they call slow steaming. That means rather than using steaming at full power to make up for, let's say, a congestion or a problem at sea, they will stick to an average speed, because that obviously controls the fuel consumption. So the key thing here is that the oil price effect could mean even more slow steaming, A, and B, also what we call blank sailings. That means that a shipping company decides not to run a particular service on a particular day. So the scheduled service is being revised. We haven't seen much of that in the south-north trade. It's primarily in the east-west trade. When go back to the slide earlier on, when we had the biggest growth in the Europe Far East, that's where the biggest vessels are. There's also, where the biggest vessels are, because there's the greatest likelihood of ship schedules being revised with more blank sailings. But as we've seen a cascading of bigger vessels into all areas, that is a risk we shouldn't underestimate. So that just basically describes the trade flows where we see big volumes. Let's say, for example, out of America to Asia, that is it's a massive area. 13%. We've got 16% between Europe, Far East, Mediterranean. That's where you come in, particularly. You see the trade into UK and Northern Europe through the Mediterranean. This is sort of the bulk of the fresh produce trade in both directions. All the others are relatively small fry. I just want to bring this back into the even bigger picture of, because when I was asked to cover this, I was asked to set logistics in the context of retail as well. So I tried to cover this as well and see what are the factors that the retail trend is developing and which are having, in a second stage, effect on the logistics chain. So we see an increase in direct buying. This was very much led by UK supermarkets, by Walmart, Asda, which is the subsidiary of Walmart in the UK, followed by others like Tesco, some of the leading UK supermarkets which have said, I just happen to live in the UK, the UK retail scene has had a disproportionate impact on retail trends in Europe. So that's why I just put that in that sense. So the other element which we've seen is increasing of multi-channel retailing. In other words, is selling into city like the Tesco Metro, for example. I don't know what you call them in Spain. So little supermarkets in yes, or when Hong Kong got 7-Elevens, for example, if you know them. So these retail outlets, which of course are very, very important as well. And of course the other factor is the rise of the e-tailers, which of course means that most of the bricks and mortars also have to provide online services and the deliveries. So what we see generally is the merger between the online and the offline. That's probably going to increase, even though if the fresh produce online business only represents a couple of percent in Germany, for example. I know the figures. Last week we heard that by the year 2020 this could go up to 7%. This in itself will have a huge impact on the logistics chain that we all part of. And the key drivers here, of course, technology, the savvy consumer. As I mentioned earlier, one is the digital native. They would basically say anytime, anything, anywhere. The other big factor which we need to take into consideration is quality, health, sustainability. Of course, that is the rise of the middle class and the steady, basically, purchasing power, which is still in the hand of the middle class and above, who are driven by greater health nutritional understanding and questioning is nutritional demand, understanding of what's actually inside the product. And we also have a continuing trend of low price and convenience. So these are almost diverging trends. I cannot say which is going to prevail because it really depends on each country's different. It basically is reflected in the movement of the different classes within different countries. So we all have, of course, a demand for basic products, which again is reflected in the retail trends who have got different products, basically almost for different classes of people in their shop windows. Now I just wanted to mention this issue of environment, the impact on banning plastic bags. That's one thing we're talking about in the UK, which is going to be, I think, one of the key things, not only in England, but of course it's been very strong in Germany. I don't know how strong it is here in Southern Europe, but the awareness that we need to reduce the amount of plastic bags and any unnecessary packaging. And I just picked out a couple of bits of packaging which I've seen myself. And the one down there, bottom right, it happens to be a Spanish company, I'm not going to name it now. These are bananas. You see them? Bananas which have been peeled. Pre-peeled bananas and then being sold. I think that's the thing which luckily didn't take off. Or the fact is you've got this bottle of mineral water on the left, which is inside a plastic bag. Which is why in the UK now, for example, we're talking about reintroducing water fountains in the city. So that people, rather than buying plastic bottles, walking on plastic bottles in their, when they go shopping, they just have their fountains. And I think it's an interesting thing where basically the world goes full circle. I remember when in any sort of village in Spain or Switzerland, you could just go to the local fountain. So perhaps you're going to see a revision of that. The other one, top right, was a South African supermarket, which is interesting that to prevent people sort of touching and palpating the fruit. I think these are, I can't quite remember what fruit they were, papayas, I think, they were papayas. So you got them inside the, to prevent them from being touched and covered in plastic and a styrofoam. They give you different types of plastics that all have to be recycled. So what we have in the UK now is just, I don't know what the situation here is, just trying to ban all unrecyclable black plastic trays. For example, when you go shopping in the UK, you've got to look at that, is this plastic tray, is this recyclable or not? Sometimes it says it is recyclable. There's no standardization. The consumer doesn't know. So we'll just put it in the rubbish and it goes into landfill. And that is basically crazy. I think it's one of the greatest challenges that we are faced with. I'm coming towards the end here. Causes of disruption and other imponderables. So, demography. Basically, a population, digital native on one hand, on the other hand, a population that's growing older, that are the ones who've got the purchasing power. You've got, again, two different elements moving in two different directions, and the logistics chain has to be able to react to this. The process of digitization, cryptocurrencies and blockchain. I just throw this in here. We've discussed it a lot at various conferences late, in climate change. Then, possibly the greatest cause of disruption is political risk. There's something which we cannot control. It really depends on what's happening in which country, which political regime is actually coming to power. Then there are other imponderables which we can measure to some extent. The oil price, which could rise by up to 20% this year, which is going to feed on all logistics areas, from trucking to shipping to rail, air transport. The interest rate policies. I mean, the American We see the stock market in America crash last week. 10% went down. Why? Because they think that the era of cheap money is coming to an end. So, are we going to see an increase in interest rate? People would say, yes, the world economic forecasts are pretty good at the moment, which is why we need to prevent the economy from overheating, and countries like the US are leading in respect of increasing the interest rate. We've done it in the UK as well. Of course, we depend very much also what still happens in Europe, or the EU, I mean. That leads me to the next point of Brexit. Brexit is not only a UK phenomenon, because it exists in other countries as well, under a different name. I don't want to go into detail for that. And of course, the increasing risk of bankruptcies. It looks as if I'm just painting a very negative figure, but I just thought it's quite good to actually point out the things, the risks that we are faced with. This I've covered before. Now I just thought to end up with a couple of wayward questions. Does anyone know this bird there? Yeah. Dodo, I don't know what you say, probably call it in other languages. The dodo. Then we've got the drone on the side, and then we've got a picture of a container terminal in Algeciras, and then to the right, that's supposed to be Bitcoin. Will drones replace reefer trucks? How are we going to have perishable drones? We had someone talk about this at the logistics hub in Berlin last week. Interesting, up to a futuristic vision. Cool-free transportation. I mean, to some extent, that is what one of the gentlemen who unfortunately can't be with us here, Ron Wills, has been raising in one of his talks a couple of years ago. Blockchain or blocked drain? How do we know that blockchain is actually going to work? Is this just going to be one of the new technologies that is going to solve all our problems, creating greater transparency, that we're having one-to-one relationships between buyers and sellers? Is this going to empower the producer? Will he be able to go directly talk to the retailer? I don't have any answers. Conclusions. Rising middle class consciousness, convenience, environmental and health. These are the key factors. Asia will remain the driver in terms of fresh produce demand and technological change. I don't have to go into detail, you're probably aware of that. Impacting fresh consumer habits, fresh produce logistics solutions, and what we see is the value market clearly outpacing volume in the future. And disruption, polarization is here to stay. Jump, that's it. That's me. Thanks very much. Well, I didn't talk too long. Let me just get out of this.
It's a good picture.
Help! Technician.
Press the escape button.
Huh?
Escape on the keyboard.
Oh, escape. So, as I'm doubling also as your moderator, I now have the honor to introduce to you Professor Francisco Artes, who you all know, I believe. And I had just the honor to speak to him in a couple of minutes, who's telling us all about post-harvest and refrigeration. Is that right?
Post-harvest panorama.
Okay. Francisco, Paco.
It's a nickname.
That's what you told me to call you.
I mean, it's a nickname.
Okay.
It's quite used for people who are called Francisco, at least in Spain or probably in South America. Call it Paco, other things like that.
Or for the
So you are not having difficult questions this time?
I don't know.
I mean, they told us there is something like 10 minutes of questions. No more the difficult ones.
You don't want he wants easy questions. Shall I give him easy questions?
No, easy questions for me, the difficult ones for him.
Sorry.
You want to ask one question?
Oh, you got a question to me?
Yeah.
Okay.
The slow steaming.
Sorry?
The slow steaming.
I can't hear you, sorry.
Sorry, slow steaming.
Slow steaming.
Slow steaming, yes.
Yeah. Do you guys see, I mean, obviously with the tracking of vessels, do you see that there's a direct correlation between the oil price? I mean, because 2 years ago it was up at $100 a barrel. It's now went down to $41 a barrel. Do you find that there's a correlation between vessels arriving more on time with the price of oil being less?
Of course not.
Just to their bottom line, and they just say, well, thanks a lot. They go slow steam always.
I mean, there's the same question that people would have. Have you ever noticed that the price at the petrol pump is reflecting in any way the price level in the oil price? There's always what the French call décalage, isn't it?
Yeah.
So there's always a couple of sort of months later, because everyone, this is a market in itself, which is actually, to some extent, doesn't actually reflect the real supply and demand, because there's so many elements in the chain that control, and there's always a time factor. But it's a good question, of course.
So it's more just actually the fact that they're always going to slow steam. It's not really linked to the price.
They will continue to slow steam. The question, of course, is that if you have more ships, more bigger ships, which I didn't mention, you have more transshipment. And with more transshipment, you increase the risk. The risk of breakages during the supply chain. And that is a great opportunity for technology to sell itself into that risk, increasing risk of the supply chain. Hope that answers the question.
Yeah.
And now, I don't know. He's closer. Sorry.
So you said that the freight share represents only 3% of total container traffic, but that's in terms of volume, not in terms of revenue.
That's volume only.
And in revenue,
I don't know.
because
All I know is increasing.
yeah, because Maersk recently reported that $500 million in revenue for 2017, I think.
They've increased so what, 500 million? So
The revenue.
they increased it, but yes.
Like $500 million dollars.
Yeah.
Okay. And it was, I think it was caused because of the trade increasing policy that they implemented last year. But I don't know if
There's another factor that comes in with Maersk, I believe. I can't speak for Maersk, but what it is quite clearly what they have done. It's a history of investing in remote reefer monitoring, which allows them to track and trace their assets in function of need. So they know, technically, they can compare the different technologies which are being used in their containers, how often a container goes through the equator, determine which components of which reefer unit manufacturer are performing better than others. So they have had a tremendous potential of controlling their costs. In other words, they can control the inbound supply chain. So by reducing costs, they started to buy fewer containers in 2012 and then increased again, but others didn't buy as many containers as Maersk had stopped buying. That's why we had the shortage in supply and demand. Because Maersk itself buys between 25 to 30 million 30,000 new reefer containers a year. So it's basically 100 to 140,000 new reefer containers that enter the system every year. And when Maersk decided, because it introduced its policy of controlling, having a better control of its asset, it could save its costs, but it was not capable of increasing the freight rate. But the others had to undercut, but weren't quite as fast in reacting as Maersk did. So Maersk has got the technical edge. They are the leaders in the field. All the others are following or are not telling us what they're doing. I'm talking as a journalist. That is what I gather.
Last week I heard from some within the banana industry players that rates have been increased compared to last year. So if you take into account that the only 3% of total traffic is of that 25% belongs to bananas, you know that it has a huge impact in the bottom line of shipping lines.
But bananas, you think, but it's got a huge. Again, but that's what we're just looking at. It's basically just like a Russian doll, isn't it? It's apart, and apart. So it looks a much bigger. It's very important because 25% are bananas still in the fruit trade. So if there's a problem there, let's say you have an outbreak of what's it called, M1 or M2 disease in Latin America. If you suddenly have this the problem, or there's increase in Panama disease in the Philippines, for example, that's had an impact. But there are other banana suppliers that fill in. I mean, Ecuador still, I think Ecuador and Guatemala, they're the top producers, top exporters. But if you had a problem in a banana plantation and the problem proliferated, you would suddenly have a hole. But for a shipping company, you'd say, well, let's ship another product. Let's ship salmon from Chile. They can always sort of move from one product to another. But of course, all supply chains are geared towards one product. So this is a cause of disruption. Sorry, I mean, I'm just, because
You are the moderator.
is that okay? So I'm moderating. I'm an immoderator. I'm sorry.
I can't moderate you.
You tell me to shut up.
But we have people from Bioconservacion. They are up to you.
No, it's good. You hear a lot that airplane manufacturers are investing a lot in along with the manufacturers of engines. That they are increasing fuel efficiency. Do you hear the same within the shipping industry that manufacturers of engine for vessels are improving fuel consumption efficiency?
Well, I mean, I know that one area that I know is obviously that there's been a huge fuel efficiency increase in the areas of reefer container operations. The reefer, in other words, energy consumption. Because if you've got, I mean, for example, the energy consumption of a conventional reefer vessel is much higher than a container vessel. So it's a huge cost. So apart from fuel, there's also the refrigeration cost. So with a container that is smaller, and of course all the technologies, for example, to reduce when you do cold ironing, you get ship goes and plugs into the shore power. They can reduce their some of all the lightings and refrigeration as well. That could have an impact. But I think that's a long discussion. I think we should go. Is that okay?
Yeah.
I think
I'll play with you.
okay. Sorry, Steve.
Yeah, I think at the last talk I heard you give, maybe 18 months ago, you were mentioning that most of the sea freight companies were running on negative margins overall, hence all the mergers and bankruptcies that have happened.
Yeah.
But the reefer container business was the only island of positive margins in the whole industry. Would you make any comment about how that might have changed in the last?
Actually, I have actually answered. The question is that's why the growth rate has gone down from 4%. It used to be 5%, 4.5%, sort of, and now it's just gone down to. They're becoming more conservative, but that's also a reflection of the control because of less purchasing of reefer containers. See that there is a slight slowing down in demand of reefers because they've also been affected by slow steaming. in the past, slow steaming didn't really apply to south-north trade. It was a problem of east-west. But because of the cascading of vessels and the fact that you've got other factors like strikes, other imponderabilities, if you've got a bigger vessel, there's pressure for a container vessel to be handled much faster in a port. But if you've got congestion, you of course risk lengthening the supply chain. These risk factors are an opportunity for technology, whether it's controlled atmosphere or technology that you're involved in here. I think we're finished. Is that okay?
Okay.
So.